Okay, I think we can get started. Well, first of all, hello everyone. My name is Elisa Scholz, and together with Glynnis, Maynard, we are the co-editors of ARC Volume 36.2, Text and Image. We'd like to welcome you all to our virtual launch event. For those of you who are unfamiliar with our journal, the Archaeological Review from Cambridge is a biannual journal of archaeology, which is run on a non-profit voluntary basis by researchers at the University of Cambridge. ARC publications have played an important role in promoting academic discourse on methods and theory in archaeology, and have been doing so for actually quite a long time. In fact, we're really happy and excited to continue our 40th anniversary celebrations with the release of this volume. We would like to thank the Archaeological Review from Cambridge committee members for their help in bringing our volume to print, the anonymous reviewers who dedicated their time and energy to improving our papers, and the MacDonald Institute and our subscribers for their continued support of the ARC. We'd also like to thank Livia de Simone for her incredible cover art, which if you haven't seen, you're going to see it in a bit, and Simone Russo for his help in formatting the volume. We're also really excited to have Professor Stephen Houston here with us tonight as our keynote speaker. But first, we'd like to give you a brief introduction to the theme of the volume. So, Glyn, over to you.
Okay. So you should all see a image of our cover and our front cover and our back cover. So visual communication systems have existed throughout our human history. The origin of image systems reaches back into our deep time, and with every new discovery, from hunting scenes in Indonesian caves to an enigmatic handprint on a Spanish cave wall, we push the date further into the past. Writing systems, by contrast, are a relatively new invention, but they span the conceptual gamut, appearing as indistinguishable from figurative art to looking highly linear or abstract. Figuring out the difference, or arguing in favor of complementarity between image and text systems, has thus remained a recurring theme in modern scholarship. Various figures throughout Western history have contributed to this debate, which for many years created a polarization between these two systems, resulting in an artificial hierarchy of text over image. The very fact that this debate even exists means it's very hard for us to precisely delineate between the two. More recently, there have been renewed attempts to circumvent this perceptual hierarchy, instead blurring the boundaries between text and image and analyzing their cognitive effects upon one another. With volume 36.2, we wanted to provide fresh perspectives on earlier issues published within the ARC, particularly volume 3.2, Archaeology and Texts, edited by John Bennett, and volume 19.1, Art and Archaeology. We hope that the papers in this volume provide positive and novel contributions to this field. As you can all see, this is a Zoom webinar, which means that you will be able to see only the panelists who are going to talk. However, you will still have the opportunity to interact with us. After the talk, there will be a Q&A session, so if you would like to ask something with your mic and camera on, please raise your virtual hand by using the function at the bottom of your screen, and we will allow you to share your question. Alternatively, you can type in your question using the Q&A button. If you experience any technical issue, please use the chat function and we will try to handle the problem as soon as we can. This session will be recorded for archival purposes, but it is not live streamed. The video will be available online on our YouTube channel within the next few days. Finally, as Elisa said, we are a nonprofit student-led journal. So if you want to support us, we remind you that you can purchase a copy of this volume using the link that we will share now in the chat. And other volumes can also be purchased through our website.
Okay, so we'd like to present the contents of our volume really quickly to try and give you a bit of a flavour. You can see all the papers on the left of the screen. Our first paper is by Rachel Phillips at the University of Cambridge. It's titled From Story to Memory, Some Combat Images from the Early Late Bronze Age Greek Mainland. Rachel's paper, as the title suggests, discusses early late Bronze Age imagery, focusing on two combat images on small portable objects. In a world where no texts exist, or not texts that tell stories anyway, narrative is told through images and through the words that these images inspire. The images rely on orality and its stories, while orality and its stories rely on the existence of such images. Rebecca Hodgkinson from the University of Oxford examines how the pandemic has affected researcher access to physical archives and their images in the second paper of our volume, titled Overexposed: Looking Around Photographic Texts and Images in the Archive. Her paper analyses a photograph from the Curzon collection at the British Library, showing how online catalogues can be misleading in their descriptions, not only by upholding the often colonial nature of the photographs themselves, but also by conflating the boundaries between official archive titles and handwritten notes.
Archives take us into our next paper, titled The Body as in and with Text, Doing Bioarchaeology with Archives, by Lauren Hossack from the University of Colorado at Boulder, and Alana L. Warner-Smith and Shannon A. Novak from Syracuse University. The authors propose a novel approach to the archive, where social bioarchaeology can be used as a method to more meaningfully integrate past skeletal bodies with their historical lived experiences. Here, temporally disparate sets of text and images work together to build something new, instead of being approached as a dialectic.
Our fourth paper by Ollie Croker from the University of Oxford, titled Archaeolix Bionessimos: Visual and Linguistic Humor in the Athenian Classroom, analyzes a Greek vase from 5th century BCE Athens with an unusual inscription. By considering the inscription in the context of the imagery, the paper emphasizes the humorous element in the clever interplay of text and image, designed for both illiterate and possibly illiterate audiences.
Text can also influence the perception of built space, as explored by Madeleine Ouimet from the University of Chicago in her paper, Maybe It's a Sign: Observation and Doubt in a Mesopotamian Omen Series. Madeleine examines the less studied unobserved omens in the Mesopotamian terrestrial omen series, Shuma Alu, to show how the text acts as the prime vehicle determining imagery in these omens, thereby mediating human expressions of doubt, uncertainty, and the physical senses.
The sixth paper by Saskia Kirschbaum and Julio Wiedin from Goethe University in Frankfurt, titled Beyond the Written Content: The Deliberate Use and Omission of Coin Inscriptions, analyzes the role of text and image on coins from the classical and Hellenistic period in the Mediterranean and Asia Minor. The authors take into consideration two case studies. The first example focuses on the issue of logocentrism and shows how images can be politicized by texts. The second example shows how the absence of text creates an interesting opportunity for pictorial elements to be interpreted not only on a visual level, but also as a substitute for text.
This interplay between text and image is further explored by Jordan Miller from the University of Oxford in his paper titled Emblematic Representation on Ancient Egyptian Apotropaic Wands. Jordan investigates how external factors of meaning, ontology, and decorum influence the choice of combinations of hieroglyphic signs and pictorial images used as iconographic representation on wands. He argues that the polysemic nature of hieroglyphic writing enabled its flexible adaptation by its makers and users, either more as image or as text, deployed in imaginative ways with varying levels of social interpretation. Michael Nice from the University of Uppsala and Rebecca Franco-Valle from the University of Bergen, in their paper titled Devices of Ekphrasis: A Multimodal Perspective on Viking Age Animal Art, propose a new way of approaching Viking animal art on non-monumental practical objects. They explore a rereading of the concept of ekphrasis, in which animal art participates in Scandinavian Viking culture as visual references for poetry. Furthermore, they consider how the visual, material, and kinetic properties of animal art, far from being merely decorative, instead enhance the mental spaces between objects and oral stories. The ninth paper in our volume considers how text and image can contribute to political and social objectives, as analyzed by Freya Tarrin from KU Leuven in her paper, Image and Text to Educate the Nation, reinterpreting the woodblock print series, Pictorial Record of Products of Great Japan. Freya discusses how, in this woodblock print series, the image and text were planned completely in tandem with one another. Incentivized by the Japanese state, the distribution and reception of these traditional and popular woodblock prints in a new educational context contributed to the state's didactic program of the 1870s.
And in our final paper, Amelie Lutz from LMU analyzes the different relationships between Andromeda and stone in her paper titled Andromeda's Marmorium Opus in Roman Literature and Wall Painting. She examines 3 wall painting types through which these diverse associations are explored in art, revealing a complex dialogue between the 2 media. We hope these contributions provoke reflection and encourage renewed dialogue on text and image studies. But now for the main event, it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Stephen Houston, our keynote speaker. Stephen Houston is a GP Family Professor of Social Sciences at Brown University, where he also teaches anthropology. Professor Houston is a specialist in classic Maya civilization, writing systems, and indigenous representation. He has prepared many books and articles, including most recently Temple of the Night Sun, The Maya with Michael Coe, and The Life Within, Classic Maya and the Matter of Permanence. He has edited several collections of papers related to the subject of our volume, including The First Writing, Script Invention as History and Process, The Disappearance of Writing Systems, Perspectives on Literacy and Communication, co-edited with John Baines and John Bennett, and The Shape of Script, How and Why Writing Systems Change. Professor Houston has also been honoured with a MacArthur Genius Award, along with fellowships and grants from, amongst others, the Guggenheim Foundation and the National Science Foundation. In 2018 and 2019, he served as the inaugural Kislak Chair of the Study of the History and Cultures of the Early Americas at the Library of Congress. So please join us in warmly welcoming Professor Stephen Houston, who will be speaking on Hidden in Plain Sight, Disguised Script and Pseudo Writing as Picture Play. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Elisa, and my thanks to both of you and also to the McDonald Institute and Cambridge in general for inviting me to speak today. I love Cambridge. I love everything about it, and it's indeed an honor to participate in a book project that I've been aware of for a long time. I think when I was an undergraduate, I saw one of the first issues of this journal, and it's most impressive. But today I'm going to be looking at a slightly different topic, which has to do with 2 different kinds of graphic notation, which of course are intrinsically related to the subject of the book that our 2 friends here have edited so well and so adroitly. The talk is entitled Hidden in Plain Sight, and I'm going to be first looking at what I call disguised script, which has a delayed reception. That is, you have to work hard at this. We say in the United States, you need to put in sweat equity. And that is the case with this as well. The second part of my talk, and this is something I've published on a bit, but some of these ideas are entirely new, concerns what I would call pseudo writing. And this is writing that isn't, in a sense. It looks like writing, it appears to be writing, and yet in fact, it's essentially void of semantic and phonic content in a direct sense, although contextually, it certainly is emanating messages. So that's thwarted reception. You'll never get directly into the meaning of that script because it's simply not being recorded. So let's look at that first part that I'd promised and as a part of my presentation this afternoon or this evening to you over there in Cambridge. One of the probably things I need to get out of the way first, though, is to address a series of, you might call them orientations or even a set of almost moralizing principles about writing systems that tend to occupy our minds insofar as we look at this subject as I have for many decades. And they often involve as well debatable premises. The first one that we need to address squarely is the attitude or the disposition of openness, which is this notion that secrecy is bad, that we want to be as transparent as possible about the communications of journalists or presidents of the United States, or for that matter, professors at Brown University, and that this transparency is not only edifying, but it's also morally necessary in communication. And that might not be the case in many different parts of the world and at different times. The other related concept, and of course I have to illustrate this with this not so active peasant and Peter Bruegel, the elders painting the harvesters, has to do with another premise, which is that efficiency is the main point of writing and of imagery, that we're supposed to be communicating with lightning dispatch what is intended to be transported by these messages. So we want to go faster and faster and faster and faster and faster, almost as though we are part of this gigabyte or megabyte or a tetrabyte highway in which we certainly find ourselves in the midst of the Zoom communication. And then there is another premise, which is that embellished and ornate and Baroque forms are bad, that ornamentation is something we should be avoiding. And this takes me inevitably to, let's say, the Vienna at the fin de siècle, where you look at theorists, as many architects do, such as Adolf Loos. Now, he was a highly problematic person in his personal life, you might say, but in quite an influential article, widely read and still read, called Ornament and Crime, which kind of says it all. He believes and asserts that the evolution of culture is marching along with the elimination of ornament from all useful objects, leaving that cube in the background designed by Loos himself. And ultimately, what would be the objective here? The objective would be a final styleless future, a stylistically vacant future in which there would be no need to change. There'd be no need for profligate investment and new embellishments. No replacements would ever be necessary. So having stated those premises, which I think we need to view with a degree of temporal skepticism with respect to our evidence, I also have to adduce a perspective that has been adumbrated by my good friend David Lurie, who's professor down at Columbia of Japanese studies and a scholar of early Japanese writing. And he makes the point, which we have to remember again and again, that all writing is essentially hidden and disguised. And this is probably true with pictorial evidence as well, until literacy ensues, until we're equipped with the capacity to look at these exegetically, to understand what might be communicated here by means of conventions. Now, I always find a reason to include my very cute grandson in every talk, particularly since he arrived in my life. But this would also occur in his own life. There is no innate literacy here. There will be eventually, we trust, but he is engaged in what has been described by psychologists and educational specialists as emergent writing. And there you see him trying his best. So let's look at a variety of examples of cryptic and disguised writing. And again, this is about a deliberate approach which attempts to make reception difficult, to delay that reception. And I think a great example of this would be this a print by Hokusai, that genius of all Japanese artists of the mostly of the early 19th century. And here you see a depiction of one of the 6 poetic immortals. But if you're in the know, and if you work hard enough, if you involve yourself in that graphic sweat equity, so to speak, you would perhaps make out that his clothing is in kanji, that is in Chinese origin logographs, but then the hiragana, or the syllables, are actually conveyed by some of the garments underneath. There's a sort of layering here, which is probably coyly and deliberately part of the way in which he's deploying these images. Now, in terms of code breaking, which I sometimes use in terms of its labeling or phraseology, but I think it's a little difficult and challenging for us as well. You would understand, therefore, the body and the clothing of this particular message as being the carrier, but the payload, the message inside, would be that writing, which you would slowly disambiguate as you looked at this over time. Now, there is a term, another bit of jargon, steganography, which simply means hidden graphs. And this is very much an important part of encryption. And we could ask ourselves, is that what we're dealing with here? This is, of course, a kind of communication that hides its own existence. And in a way, yeah, that's probably what's going on here. But steganography is more properly applied to this sort of message, which was sent by a German spy stationed in New York City just before, or in the middle, I would say, of World War I. And he is sending along a message, which if you read it, appears to be a bit of almost academic gibberish. It's what we'd ordinarily write in journals and hope people would ponder it. But in point of fact, if you choose every second letter in every word, you'll get to the message in which it tells us that Pershing sails from New York City on such and such a date. Now, is this the same as disguised writing? Well, in a way it isn't, because what we saw before was an image in which these were embedded. This kind of steganography typically employs the same inventory of graphs. And so to me, when I look at this, I think of it more in terms of a contrast in which there's a sort of, in linguistic terms, a code switching or a graph switching or a code blurring that in fact is taking place. There are many types of disguised writing, and I've been, in fact, addressing this in a class I've been teaching with my colleague Felipe Rojas at Brown University over the last couple of weeks. I'm just going to run through a couple of them, and I hope you'll find them amusing. This gorgeous object, which I happen to have seen in Beijing, it's Niello, it's from the Han Dynasty, is a good illustration of what I would describe as writing hidden by form, by that kind of embellishment, which would be thought somewhat loathsome or certainly best avoided by people like Adolf Loos. This is what is called a Hu vessel. It's a particular shape of vessel, which had its own rich nomenclature in Chinese society. As you can see, it's from right after the first unification of China with that short-lived dynasty, the Jin dynasty, and it is fully in the Han period. This belonged to a prince. Now we're going to look at this image of all of the rich designs around the exterior, at least in the middle part of this Hu vessel. And I think all of us would, it probably at first glance, as you engage in that breaking of this code, see possibly the same forms, but a more considered apprehension of what is being depicted here would eventually lead you to the appreciation that there are minute differences. And in point of fact, these are disguised Chinese characters. Now, my good friend Haicheng Wang, who's a professor at the University of Washington, has studied this in particular, along with specialists elsewhere at NYU and the like, or at the Bard Center, excuse me, in New York City. And you can see here in the upper left hand of this diagram, the actual Hu sign, which is quite mimetic. It's describing or depicting in a fairly, I think, persuasive fashion that vessel. Down below, you begin to see it becoming more schematically handled by later scribes, including someone who is writing in the Han script. And then that is the so-called bird or insect script vase that we were looking at. And the red lines are highlighting for you this reference to the vase on which it is found. It is a kind of self-referential object. All of us who work with writing systems are increasingly and painfully aware of the fact that context means everything. These just don't float in space or digitally as here, but they occur in particular objects. Now, one of the things that we can probably observe about this text is it's got this poem that isn't particularly interesting. It refers to itself, the vessel, the vase. It exhorts the vessel and us to find it abundant in aroma. Eventually, you will be satisfied by the liquids that would be dispensed from it. But this leads me to another observation that strikes me, and this is something I've observed with my good friend Andreas Stauder at Paris, which is the more flamboyant the presentation, as you see here, undoubtedly in this vase, this Hu vessel from the Han period, is we can perceive an almost inverse relationship. The more disguised the forms, often the simpler the message. There seems to be some sort of basic inversion here, which would be, I think, usefully grasped by someone who would be so inclined. To give you an example of this, I'm going to turn to my own, so to speak, writing system. I didn't devise this, but I've been its servant and slave, so to speak. I've been enslaved to this writing system for decades. It's just, I'm so besotted with it. And this is Maya writing, which is being recorded here in about AD 760. And even if you had begun to know and knew something about Maya iconography, you might see some bills, some beaks, some eyes here and there, perhaps a limb, perhaps a hand. This is an instance of full figure glyphs, glyphing. It's a kind of a graphic behavior within Maya signs. It's relatively rare, and I've just published on it in a book that's out now essentially from Cambridge on the hidden language of ancient writing. Now, to get back to that point about inversion I mentioned before, if you actually attempt to read this extraordinary welter of writhing bodies and shapes, which would cause anyone to be somewhat distressed visually, you in fact make out pretty simple values. The lowercase there simply represents a syllable, mu and t, and they're being used to reinforce a word, bird, mut. That is all that's being recorded by fully half of this full figure glyph. Now, that's not the only example. Let's move back in Japan, albeit to a somewhat earlier period, long before Hokusai, and we get to this national treasure, which is on display in the Kyoto National Museum. It's a kind of script called Ashide, and it appears to have these somewhat wan and slightly depressing images in the background of limp vegetation. And in point of fact, here you see an instance of another form of disguised writing. These represent syllables in a Japanese script. They would be painted first, and then in a very, very expert manner, which would have been admired by people looking at this scroll. The text would be placed later, but you have to work at it. Now, the second kind of hiding is hidden by placement, and sometimes this would involve non-human reception. You've got cursed scrolls out of lead there in Bath, not too far from where most of you are today. But this is an example of Prince Shotoku, who is here depicted in a wooden sculpture that's up at the Harvard Art Museums. And what was discovered, as with many such carvings of the so-called Kamakura period, is that if you pry them open, you will discover inside documents that have been placed there. These are, specialists tell me, parts of the Lotus Sutra, and they would essentially emanate a kind of solace to the person contemplating the image outside, thinking and feeling quite remorseful about the Buddha's absence in their life. This would be hidden by placement, but then we can also enter into addressing the matter of hiding by scale. And a wonderful example of this, which I really delight in, is Jewish micrography. And here you can see an example of the Book of Jonah. These are often 19th century in date. And there's the whale down beneath, and there's a somewhat bearded figure is, of course, Jonah, but you also make out that minutely in the background is the book itself that is helping to delineate these shapes. Now, a lot of this tradition, we always have to think about history and context and setting and the motives of the makers, has to do with monotheistic credos, which of course have to do with the fact that we are forbidden to make images in the shape of God. And so that's always going to lead to a degree of tension in any kind of imagistic or imaging tradition, such as you see here. This micrography goes back to the mezuzot that some of you might have seen in the doorways of observant Jews. They tend to be angled slightly because of Talmudic arguments, but there it would say, it would be an assertion of monotheism that, oh, Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, but it's minutely so present there. And it brings us back to why this would also exist here. It's a kind of observation and a delicate negotiation of that necessary observance for a devout person of the second commandment. And essentially it resolves the issues that might attend to the matter of imagery. And then as a final example, I love this. This is a book that shows these buildings that ordinarily look as though they firmly belong in the late 17th, early 18th century. And these are by the architect Gobert. These were never constructed, but in fact, they represent all the individual letters of Louis XIV's name, Louis le Grand, and therefore 12, probably an apostolic number as well, in a kind of way that must have appealed to Louis XIV, were never constructed. You can see just down below that these are essentially constituted in the shape of a monogram. So just to wrap up this first part of my I hope, brief presentation today, I don't want to go on too long because we have good Q&A and people have things to do. We can perhaps itemize somewhat what might be said about these instances of disguised writing, which is they have often layerings of meanings. There's image, there's text. They often collude and often conflict in ways that are obviously intriguing and I would even say delectable to the human appreciation of these forms. And also they are about prolonging this process of reading what might be said there. Sometimes no one is going to be able to get it. You have to be in on this graphic joke, so to speak. But above all, they're about delayed reception. And so they are luxuriant, they are flamboyant, they are encoding in ways that require a clever person to sort through them. And I think they're about wit, they're about being fun, they're about a sort of amusement that is also being studied by one of the contributors to the volume that our friends have edited. And they might also ultimately induce a mindset. Now, the second part of this talk is going to deal with the matter of pseudo writing. And this is really quite categorically distinct, in my opinion, from disguised reading, because there will never be reception. That arc of semiosis by which you eventually read or acquire the so-called payload of that image is never going to be satisfying to you. It has no payload. It has the semblance of one. And this is indeed a form of thwarted reception, pseudo writing, of writing that isn't. It's graphic, and I'm not using this flippantly, but it is nonsense. Graphic nonsense, probably best equipped with that hyphen, and of writing that isn't. Now, let me also give you some concepts that might help us to sort this out and flesh out what I'm about to tell you, or what I'm about to observe. And the first is, why not draw observations or inspiration from nature, always with the idea that the processes that I'm about to describe to you are, of course, conditioned or inflected by Darwinist process taking place over countless years. I'm not making this kind of argument here, but I do wish to establish a kind of broad analogy between something here, which is the king snake, inoffensive, and that is an example of a mimetic target, in the sense that there is a truly deadly snake, the coral snake, which is rather astoundingly similar. There are, of course, differences in the way the colors are juxtaposed, but this is an example of defensive mimesis in which the king snake is somehow acquired by Darwinist process, and I don't want to impute intentionality here, but it's acquired the ability to mimic a really scary snake, which I have had many encounters with. Although the poor coral snake is a little like a, I don't know, it's like the Quaker of the viper world. I've been in ponds with them. They don't seem to bother me, and rummaged around steely while they sit nearby. They don't offend me terribly, but boy, will they kill you flat. Now, there's an offensive sort of mimetic target, which would be something like this, in which a turkey vulture is a pretty inoffensive being, but the zone-tailed hawk is eerily similar in its plumage and the way it flies and the shape of its wings to this more inoffensive bird. And that would, of course, give it that moment, that aperture in which to lunge in to seize its prey. So that's an offensive, as opposed to a defensive kind of mimetic target. But if we abstract from my discussion right there, again, just throw out any idea that I'm speaking about Darwinist metaphors for human behavior, which I don't really believe in very much, we can look at human choices that tend to approximate this as well. And these are mimetic targets in writing. And sometimes they can include, for instance, I've deliberately picked something from India. This is from Ulfa, the king of Mercia. And there you can see what is quite obvious to any specialist, which is it is reproducing a more or less contemporary unit of currency by an Abbasid Khalifa. This is Al-Mansur, and this would have been a portable object, widely traded. It is therefore an example of an object of some value that's being targeted by coin makers, by mints in this kingdom off in England at about that time. But it's an external process. I doubt that they knew Arabic. Maybe they did, maybe a few did, but generally speaking, it isn't really meant to be legible. It is meant to emanate this aura of value and of prestige. Now, there is an example of internal mimesis, which would be Maya glyphs, a situation that I have studied in detail. Those are pseudo glyphs from the late classic period dating to about 8700. Those are an instance of internal mimesis in which there is a target. It happens to be legible writing within the Maya tradition, but it's within the same society, albeit one that is riven by a lot of, we presume, class tensions as well. Now, pseudo writing and writing that isn't, as I call it, is almost on this infinite regress of a representation of a representation, and go on, but it is all about really the process of depiction, of image making, which happens to poach a little bit into the domain of phonic graphs. It is also, and this is, I think, a point that needs to be spelled out, they are providing you inadvertently with what they think the essence of this writing looks like. What is it graphically? How does it function in terms of its formal attributes and its composition visually over the surface of that particular pot? And so, yeah, it's graphic nonsense, but what you're also seeing is the presence of graphic forms, but without question, the absence of direct sound and meaning. There is a contextual evocation of the legible writing, but beyond that, I think we need to make, though, another final distinction here before I begin looking at instances of pseudo writing. And it is this: pseudo writing, of writing that isn't, of graphic nonsense, as I consider this cross-culturally, is not really a binary. That is, there's a gradient of resemblance in which, as in this Greek example, you're going from fairly close representations of letters that are disposed in a form that should make sense. And by the end, when you get back to that funerary stela being depicted on that vase in the lowermost part of this image, it's just a series of little dots and dashes, partly conditioned by the scale. It's a kind of small image, but it is going from a pretty close semblance to one that is no more than a memory. It's really a whiff of such graphic systems that they are mimicking. Maya glyphs are no different. You can have fully legible text, then there are legible glyphs that are just strung together and juxtapositions that have no meaning whatsoever. There might be some legible phrases that are embedded in complete nonsense, and then it is reducible to that graphic essence of writing as they're presenting it here, which is just a bunch of ovoids that are slightly contrastive. Now, this is another point to consider, which is that these examples of pseudo writing are attested around the world, but in all honesty, they're not ubiquitous. You see them in instances of Chinese externally. You see them in instances of Pseudo-Arabic externally and sometimes internally, and Pseudo-Maya internally. They are in some ways parasitizing. I don't want to get too biological here, but they're certainly hitching on legible writing. They require a model, but in all instances, they pertain to very particular context. Now, this example, for instance, of pseudo-Chinese writing is coming from chinoiserie in Europe. It's evoking distant lands. It has to do with fashions and waves and trends of taste and the like in 17th century and 18th century Europe. And the other thing to consider about this, and this will take us into something you'll know well, is frequently they're almost placeholders. They're meant to be locations where maybe a knowledgeable reader will insert the right glyph. And we're see an instance of this from Ceibal in Guatemala dating to 775. In fact, almost all of these pseudoglyphs among the Maya date to about a 100-year span, which is also pretty fascinating. Now, this is one example of placeholding that we've all used, the lorem ipsum, which comes from Cicero. It's a filler text, and you're simply there arranging what would appear to be a totally irrelevant text in order to see how it would look on the page. Now, I've long been fascinated, maybe because my grandson's on the scene now, by giving this a kind of a special force in my own life, has to do with what is a relationship between the emergent writing, which we saw with him in an earlier image, and what might be placed on this particular example being produced by a child of about, I would say about 3 to 4. Well, it's kind of similar. It has linearity. There's a kind of sequencing of signs. There's a discreteness or a perceivable segmentation to the signs. They're not yet going into the cursive, which has now been bounced out of the US curriculum for grade school. But also there's frequently a kind of abstract or non-pictorial condition that's going on with emergent writing in the West. There's what might be called a lack of iconicity. But we'll leave that behind, hopefully. We don't continue in life doing that as doodles in exceptionally boring faculty meetings. Now, let's look at two examples of pseudoscript as I wrap up this talk. I don't want to go on too long. And one of the finest examples is actually not far from me right now. It's down in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it's Triptych by the great Flemish artist Robert Campin. It's called the Maynard Altarpiece. And if we start moving in, you'll see how we are here dealing with thwarted reading, not with delayed reception. And if we get closer, obviously it's a scene of the Annunciation. There's the Virgin Mary looking at a book and somehow not noticing that an angel has descended into the room. You'd think she'd be a little more observant. But what I'm mostly focusing on is not only the snuffed out mirror, perhaps a premonition of Christ's mortality and ultimately his perceived rebirth within the Christian faith, but also two examples of contrastive pseudo writing. Well, there's an example of non-legible text. It's obviously in this little breviary or missal that's placed on the table. It's probably next on a reading list for the Virgin Mary. But then most interestingly, there on that Majolica vase, probably imported from Florence into Northern Europe, is an instance of another form of pseudo writing, which has clear mimetic targets. It's pseudo-Hebrew. It's pseudo-Kufic, which would be, of course, that variant of Arabic script, which is highly or acutely angular. And there's even with the K, probably an evocation of pseudo-Byzantine script, something from Greece itself and from the Greek. So let's look at a really different example of thwarted writing, which has nothing to do with intention, nothing to do with graphic ingenuity, but has everything to do with a tragic incapacity on the part of this person. And here we're dealing with a figure renowned in outsider art in the United States named James Castle, who lived for most of the 20th century, born in the 19th. And here I'm juxtaposing a photograph of James Castle with how he depicted himself in the kind of materials that he often would play around with in the care of his family house. He had to be cared for by his family because he was deaf and mute, and there were other apparent difficulties as well for him, other kinds of challenges. Now he intrigues devotees of contemporary art for a number of reasons, and his objects can sell at very high value. Probably, I think, because he's dealing with a lot of issues that Cy Twombly and others might be concerned with. What are the relations of visual marks to language? What is the relation of originals to copies? What is the relation between the handmade to the mass made? Here we're almost sending a shout out to Andy Warhol. And so all of this seems to be addressed by someone who is completely oblivious to this market and outsider art, and instead is devising with his own spittle often and using found paper or scraps that be in his family farm in Idaho. And he is devising a series of pseudo-graphic or written experiments that go from what I would call category one. You've got layout, you've got, though, invisible text. It's a little like the placeholder concept we looked at before. He's probably looking at magazines of the time or perhaps a family album. And then there are two other categories in James Castle's pseudo-scripting. One would be legible letters, which are in word-like sequences, but never compose themselves into any kind of form that would dispense meaning into an adequate standard. And then entirely novel codes, creating his own writing system, which again, might be trafficking or transporting in payloads or truths that we simply don't have access to. So what is the mimetic target here for categories 1 and 2? Well, they're Latin letters and Arabic numbers. He's aware of them, he's looking at them, but there is ultimately an inability to communicate. The reception is forever thwarted in his instance. But nonetheless, you're seeing here in full display an interplay of text and image, There's a concern with sign segmentation and clustering, but ultimately the communication becomes impossible. And whatever he wished to bridge with these scraps of paper he left behind and have excited so much interest in outsider art circles in the United States and abroad is a link and a bond with other human beings, which ultimately is not bridgeable for him. So to wrap this up, I think with not disguised writing, but with this sort of writing that isn't, we see a variety of functions. And ultimately, isn't this really what we discover, which is we can do comparisons, then ultimately it's in the granularity of the local and of the temporally distinct, where we find really the most persuasive explanations. And we almost have to view these things in a binocular or stereoscopic fashion in order to acquire this broader truths of comparative import, but also these local ones that help to explain the details and the specificities or evidence. And so what we've looked at here is obviously a yearning for the exotic and the temporally distant, and finding in them things to cherish and things to want and things to include in our material world. And then beyond that, particularly with someone like Castle, there are aspirational graphs. They're almost sketching for us or delineating the limits of literacy. And this has been indeed an explanation for the pseudoscripting among the classic Maya. Now I'm interested in art, and I'm giving a related series of lectures on this subject next year at the National Gallery of Art as the Andrew Mellon lecturer there in Washington, DC. But I can't help but think of other clever individuals who themselves, with all their high degree of visual and graphic dexterity, have been able to address these questions of meaning and of sound and of graphic form. And who better to look at than Jasper Johns? And you could see here his famous false start, which has been sold for some colossal amount of money, as is true for most of the Jasper paintings. And there is apparently a degree of legibility, but it's so frustrating because our referential impulses wish to see yellow being labeled with yellow that is yellow, not blue, for heaven's sake. Or you can see that all the colors, with a few exceptions, are incongruent or incongruous or disconnected from their actual labeling. That is the point here, as Jasper Johns sometimes tells us, not to be understood, but simply to be moved internally. And he is famously known to have said that of the dozens of books that have been written about his work, he really prefers the one in Japanese, thinking back to Hokusai and the other allusions to Japanese art, because what he loved about it is that he could not understand it. So there is a deliberate impulse behind his clever inventions graphically. Now, a final example, I can't go into Zhu Bing and other figures like this, but know that asemic writing is an important part of Western art as well. And these are instances that were recorded and created over a period of some decades by Mirta de Mesace, who's an Argentinian artist. And she says something very similar to this about thwarted writing, which is you're never going to be able to read these marks, although they resemble something else mimetically. And what she finds principally important is what is happening within us as the prompt ultimately that is being triggered by these texts. And so what I've done this afternoon, or evening, I guess it is over there, is I've addressed this matter of delayed reception, but also of thwarted reception. And we've teased and poked and prodded at it. And I think ultimately, in the midst of all of these graphic adventures, we have found not only disguise and mimicry, but also fun and of what humans are impelled to do so as to make something appealing to others. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Halston, for an incredibly fascinating and stimulating lecture on pseudo writing and disguised script.
Shucks.
We would now like to open the floor for questions. We do have one question currently in the Q&A, and then we will go on to people who have raised their hands. Just to remind everyone, You can either use the raise hand function at the bottom of your screen, and we will nominate you so that you can ask your question yourself. Or if you do not wish to ask your question yourself, please type it into the Q&A and we will ask it for you on your behalf. So our first question is from Norman, and Norman says, please, could you discuss the disjunct between the degree of literacy required by the composer of any inscription and the person who inscribes it, i.e. composer versus compositor?
Well, Norman is, of course, another Mayanist. This is Norman Hammond, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. There are examples of a few pseudo script texts which actually have legible text on them also. And so what's lost here, what is essentially irretrievable, is that kind of conversation between a patron and the producer. We don't know whether these are going through market systems. They probably aren't. But ultimately, I do think that, yes, to have pseudo writing, you're going to have some exposure to literacy, and there will be literates nearby. And so that's what's especially interesting with the Maya case, because it's not this external evocation of Chinese script, let's say, or of Kufic by some potter in Florence, but they're intensely aware of the import of these texts. And many of them, as Norman well knows, are partly dynastic, but also they have and emanate a kind of magical aura. They were inscriptions that had almost thaumaturgical properties, as far as we can tell. They existed. They were thought to murmur silently in a number of cases. So the Maya instance, the Maya example is one I know best, but it really takes us into fascinating directions.
So sorry, the question was actually from Jean Wilson using Norman's computer, but Norman has another.
Oh, Norman. Okay, we're getting a full set of questions from East Anglia. Okay, it's not Grantchester where he lives, but it's some very adorable little English village. Okay, go ahead.
Norman has another comment, which is, in the Netherlandish enunciation you showed, there is a hidden message as well. The Torah scroll and its bag are overlain by the Christian Gospels in the Codex, reflecting the trope of church over synagogue.
Yeah, maybe, who knows? That's a pretty enigmatic triptych, and some people don't even know who made it. So anyway, okay, Norman, thank you. Other questions?
Yes, there's a question from Michael. I'm going to promote him. Michael, you can ask your question if you want.
Yes, I'm muting myself. And can I get a picture of myself, or is maybe not that necessary? I guess, oh, okay, here we are.
Yeah, you wanted to show off your apartment.
I need
very
to.
handsome
Yes,
apartment
actually,
it is.
Exactly, but it's just, a blue screen, actually. Anyway, hello from Uppsala University, and I'd like to contribute with a perspective and a question from, yes, an archaeological point of view. Since I am working with Viking Age materials, I've been interested in runology as a writing systems that came up in a cultural point where we are in between, as we have a writing system that is still operating in a largely oral culture. And a clever runologist at my university called Marco Bianchi made an argument that we have, also on the one side, sensical runical inscriptions, but we also have nonsense runes that just imitate runic inscriptions. And he was able to argue from semiotics, social semiotics in that case, that some of those readable and decipherable runic inscriptions are not to be considered texts, as they do not fall into the convention of writing, whereas many nonsensical runes actually do, since they are presented in a medium that is established, that is Runestones, and we have a communication group that consists of people who are literate and unliterate people who still can make some kind of meaning out of those inscriptions. And if we take this perspective for instance, and now you need to help me, those pseudo-Chinese imports or products from the 18th century in Europe, chinoiserie, perhaps in French. You know what I mean? The porcelain you show us.
Yes, I know.
Produced obviously in Europe. I would like to ask you actually, as I imagine there are people in China who can not read, but who reproduce kind of inscriptions on the one hand, who are part of this communication tradition that we have. And then on the other hand, we may have people in Europe who reproduce those Chinese characters accurately so that someone could decipher them. So I would like to ask you actually, which are to be considered texts, the decipherable ones in Europe made by Europeans, or the others that are made by Chinese people who cannot read and get it wrong?
That was a very, very long preamble, so
Yes.
I'm not even sure what the question was, other than, look, the pseudo writing is sometimes being made as on export ceramics in China. Sometimes it's being made in Delft, so that would presumably be created by people who are just responding to the imagery. In terms of your first observation, believe it or not, my first language is Swedish, and my first exposure to ancient writing were runestones in school, and I remember being taken to the Runestones up near Linköping when I was young. And those stones also have bring up another issue, which I'd like to write up with a colleague, which are the futhark. And these are coming naturally out of the abecedaries that you see, starting first in Lebanon and places, what is now Lebanon and elsewhere, but then are replicated elsewhere. And those are frequently employed almost, again, in a kind of magical fashion. And I think it is an historical tradition that would be fascinating to look at as well. So yeah, I'm into it. Yeah, interested in runestones. And as we also know, runestones are fundamentally have a sampling issue, which is when you see legible medieval runes under, let's say, a stave church in Norway, they tend to be inviting someone to dinner or perhaps about to ask someone's hand in marriage. And the Bergen runes also indicate a really broad literacy. And so I think sometimes our ideas of what writing does and what it doesn't do is going to be conditioned by sampling. Okay, any other questions? Well, is there someone else who wants to ask questions as well?
We do have two more questions in
Okay.
the Q&A.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael, for your question.
Yes, I tried at least. Thank you.
So Elizabeth Frood asks, why do you think the messages of disguised writing are so simple?
Yeah, that's a great question, Elizabeth, who has been my editor for a book, as I remember. You did something for John Baines that I contributed to. I honestly think it's cognitive. I think, without getting to making too many claims of a psychological sort, but I think the greater the burden of that kind of I don't know what, I don't want to call it graphic excess, but that's what it is. It's almost as though the message has to be simpler, that there's some hypothetical diagram on an XY axis that is probably accounting for that. But it does seem to be somewhat cross-cultural.
Michael's just typing something to clarify. Sorry, I just wanted to comment on this you were saying, and on Elizabeth's question.
Is this you, Elisa, or Michael who's asking?
No, this is me asking, because Michael
Okay.
is still, I think, typing.
Okay.
Yeah, I was wondering whether there was, rather than something cognitive, whether it's simply a matter of practicality in terms of, the execution is already so complex that it would be pretty hard to put some substantial information in all of that.
Yeah, it's really, really fascinating, and I actually haven't looked at this too rigorously, but I mean, some of us are aware, for instance, of the amazing writing that Andreas Stauder and Klotz have been looking at Karnak, where you have these architraves, just amazingly complex scenes that appear to be scenes and actually are writing. And it's almost as though, to use this jargon again, it's like there's so many payloads going on here. It's phonic, it's all of the details of how you're showing this or that deity, and these are things that really have so many streams of data coming at you that it may be necessary to achieve some degree of simplification in one of those streams. I'm not sure if that answered your question, Elisa, but that's what comes to mind.
No, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
We have Ezra asking, are there geographic patterns to historic pseudo-writing?
I'm sorry, what was that again?
Are there geographic patterns to historic pseudo-writing?
Yeah, and temporal, you bet, absolutely. And they tend to take place in the Maya, for instance, an example I know very well. It kicks in almost certainly with the highest degree of literacy. That is when you see the most inscriptions being produced, and many people be able to see writing, which would have been perhaps very limited before, as far as we can tell. And that's when it really begins to take off. It's part of this, it's in the air graphically, and they seem to be paying attention to it. And then when those kingdoms come to an end, it disappears. There's almost, to my knowledge, very little pseudo writing past what we call the terminal classic period. And literacy obviously is not one thing. It's many different dispositions, it's many different practices, it's many different attitudes, and whatever. On the one hand, I can say Maya writing came into existence probably in about 500 BC or thereabouts, according to the present estimates, roughly speaking. And we know that it's lasting until probably about 1600, 1650, depending on the researcher looking at the issue. But in point of fact, what that is as a practice is really, really different over time. It's never monumental in the earliest examples. Many of the glyphs are basically the size of a thumbnail, or perhaps a little larger than that, even in public context. It's bizarre, right? In terms of these propagandistic theories of the origins of writing. And then in the post-classic period, as you're getting up to the time of the Spanish conquest, it goes through the same miniaturizing tendency, and it's this free indulgence of different scales. It seems to be really a big thing during the classic period. That is the time that I look at most. But in order to mimic, you need to have something to mimic. And I don't think there's any doubt that the late classic period, where we see these in abundance, it has to do with the presence of literacy. And frankly, it doesn't occur in many different sites. It's really abundant in some places, it's not so abundant elsewhere. And so beyond talking about Maya literacy in the 7th century AD in the Yucatan Peninsula, we can also say this city has a different kind of literacy from that city over there. And that's the degree of subtlety, of course, that we think about in Greek writing and in many other sorts of traditions of script around the world. It's not this. So that's one of the things we learned from this kind of process of study.
Okay, we have a question from Xaba, who says, in Roman period Egypt, there are quite a few examples of pseudo-script at a time when hieroglyphs were gradually disappearing and fewer people knew how to read them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I suppose this is just a comment, but yeah.
Yeah. And I've been lucky enough to see the actual last dated Egyptian text in Phila, and it's just pretty accomplished looking, I have to say. So it probably could have continued for some time. But as we know, scripts continue to exist when there's a social investment in them. And it's something that I've studied at some length, also of course, with Professor Baines and with Jerry Cooper and with John Bennett. And it's these tail ends of writing systems that are pretty interesting. And there is a lot of pseudoscripting going on when I think literacy is really fraying in the Maya world.
Michael has written out his question, and he's saying, according to Marco Bianchi, some pseudo runes fall into the conventions of textuality and can be considered as texts according to the socio-semiotic definition, whereas other rune inscriptions do not, even though they are totally decipherable. So his question is, what does this say about the pseudo-Chinese art of Europe? Can readable copies of Chinese characters be considered texts, even though they derive from people who derive from another culture and who do not understand their meaning?
Yeah, I think the first thing one has to do in looking at literacy too, and I've done this in a variety of publications, is remember there's the act of production, there's the act of producing it, and then there's the act of reception. And those are two different things, right? And each example of those has to be seen in terms of who is putting that text on that piece of Delft pottery, what is it they think they're doing? And then, of course, there's this long and rather complex pattern of reception in which, is it being sold to this particular community or to that household, or is it just floating around? And I think in the case of chinoiserie, it's obviously about evoking the exotic. And you, Honor, and other people have written about this ad nauseum over the years. And that probably the best study, if you wanted to learn more about that, is to read Lothar von Falkenhausen's piece, which is in Race. It's a journal I serve on as an advisor. So that's really the best, I think, discussion of that abroad.
It looks like, Ezra, you still have your hand up, so I'm going to allow you to talk. If you would like to unmute yourself to ask your second question.
I want to just make a brief comment and get your reaction to it. Recently, I purchased a large abstract artwork in which there is both writing and pseudo writing. And I asked the artist why he had done that. And he said, it's an old blackboard. And what the writing says, do not run in class and do not pull the young lady's hair in class. And then it drifts off into pseudo writing. And I asked him, why did he do it? He said, he wanted me to, or anybody else, to fill in from memory what they had done. And so the pseudo writing was an attempt to stimulate memory. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about such things.
Well, all writing stimulates memory, right? There's no such thing as the consummate, perfect, complete record of anything, because to release what it has to tell you, there's got to be a lot of information behind that that's in wet storage, right? That's elsewhere. And so yeah, I think there are many books, of course, about the use of writing and contemporary art, and many different kind of discourses are going on there. It depends on, you've got Jasper Johns, but then you're also thinking about people like, again, Cy Twombly, the asemic specialists, including there's a strong tradition of this in France that was very active in a post-Dadaist movement from the 1940s on. They've got a different take on this as well. And so I think essentially I'm glad you did some ethnography. I'm glad you asked that artist what they thought they were doing. But I think it's really important to distinguish between who's producing it and then who eventually is accessing it and what they think is going on in that process. And those are two distinct categories of person.
And may I just say thank you for a wonderful lecture.
Well, thank you so much. It's good to hear that. Thank you.
Oh, Michael's posted a really long comment in the chat. I don't know if you can see this. Isn't this the same question that he asked? Yes, I think this is the same question that was in the Q&A. I actually had a brief question, because you showed those Greek vases, so that's a bit closer to what I do, although slightly later. And I wanted to hear what your opinion was on, because you essentially showed, these various gradations of pseudo writing. An interesting feature of Greek vases is, yes, some of them feature this writing that looks like alphabetic writing, but it isn't. But in other cases, there's writing that is proper writing, but it's complete nonsense. So nonsense inscriptions. And I was wondering what you thought the difference is between the two, because in one case, clearly, whoever's writing that clearly knows his or her letters.
Yeah.
But they're still not writing something that makes any sense. So is that just playing around? Is it just a joke? Or is it someone who perhaps knows the letters of the alphabet but doesn't know how to put them together?
Yeah. I mean, those are great questions. And as you know, there's a voluminous literature on these and studies of Greek pottery. For instance, there's a study I was looking at recently in which someone was looking at examining a scene. I believe it's from a ceramic that was either from or found in Sicily. But it shows a foreign policeman, a barbarian in that Greek sense. And everyone else is saying things that are kind of interpretable. And then this kind of buffoonish policeman is just spreading out a lot of gibberish. And so that again leads me to the idea that each one of these pots has an explanation of a really particular sort about why they're doing it there. My colleague Felipe Rojas wonders if some of the gibberish has to do with inebriation that would ensue from the symposium. That is, you're just getting plastered, right? And you're holding these up, and it's like, yeah, you're just bleary-eyed, and it doesn't make any sense. And maybe that's part of the jollity of the whole thing. It's a kind of deep dive into very particular evidence that I'm not obviously a specialist in, but I know there's a big literature on it.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. If anyone wants to raise their hand and ask Professor Houston something. Anyone out there? Glyn?
It's good when a subject comes to the end of questions. Means we've wrapped up the business at hand, I guess. No need to say or anything more. But anyway, it's a pleasure to do this. And as I said, I'm very fond of Cambridge, and I so admire the journal that you and your precursors have done at the university. That's every department has some initiative now and then when a grad student tries to put together a journal. As I mentioned to you before, it usually has one volume and then it kind of disappears. But you've shown an exceptional tenacity of purpose and helped to create a lot of careers and gotten people used to editing, which is an important part of, in a way, getting attention to the right ideas that people need to discuss. And so I commend all of you, and I'm so happy to participate.
Well, thank you very much. We would like to sincerely thank you for your keynote lecture. And thank you everyone for attending. We're now reaching the conclusion of our virtual launch. But please remember and look out on our social media channel for news about our next ARC volume, 37.1, going on 41 years, starting next year, which is titled Rethinking the Archaeology Heritage Divide. We hope everyone has a nice evening. Thank you so much for attending. Thank you.
Yeah, if you want to pre-order the volume, any information, I've just put all that in the chat again. Thank you so much, everyone.